Okay, so now we have our first panel of the afternoon on competition in the digital sector. So first, I have a very easy job of introducing the speakers. Of course, you see Nicolas and Thibault, and if you don't know, Nicolas is the one with a sign here saying Nicolas, who are both co-founders of DCI. And we also have Rikke Rasmussen joining us online. Rikke is a principal economist at Google, where she works in the chief economist team there and develops data-driven insights relating to regulation and competition matters. So can you maybe confirm you can hear us, Rikke, to make sure everything's good?
I can absolutely hear you. Can you hear me?
All right, fantastic. And additional fact, Rikke was also previous to being at Google, was at a very great company called CRA. All right. So now we can start with a panel. So we thought we would discuss and start from the book that Nicolas wrote. How long was it? Was it 6 years ago? On competition in the digital sector, where he developed what he calls in the book the Moligopoly hypothesis. And so what we want to do in this panel is to discuss the relevance of the insights and recommendations that were developed at the time, see to what extent they still apply or provide good guidance for policy today in light of the development we've seen in the digital space over the last few years. So for this panel, we'll start with Nicolas just setting up the scene, reminding us all of the conclusions that he developed in his book. And then after that, we'll have a discussion to discuss the relevance to today's and learnings since then. So I think, Nicolas, we can then start, and we'd really, like you to first remind us all of what the Moligopoly hypothesis is, what evidence it was actually based on, and what policy recommendations you were making at the time.
Well, thank you, Raphaël, for that. So I want to talk about essentially four things, very short. The first one is the intuition, the second one is the empirics, the third one is the policy implications, and the fourth one is where we are today. Okay, so the intuition was developed when I was spending a year with Bo at Stanford. We spent a year there. We talked to every people we could there, every people in the tech space, every people in the university. And I decided to write that book. It seemed to us to be, as we were in the US, the level of economic activity that was going on everywhere was absolutely inconsistent with the policy discussion that were taking place in Washington, DC and Brussels. So the intuition that we developed, and that was then and later picked up by David. David gave me a call when he received the book. He said, "I'm delighted by what you wrote. I've been trying to push that message across for 30 years." Is this idea of broad spectrum competition that I mentioned before. The term broad spectrum competition comes from David. So the idea is the following. The picture of big tech firms as monopolists, the neo-Brandeisian picture, is intuitively attractive, but analytically wrong. So monopoly findings based on observations of limited rivalry or contestability in the tech giants' origin markets constitute a narrow view of competition. In spite of their patent-dominant position in core origins markets, big tech firms do not live the quiet life. Their intense degree of effort, manifest in R&D expenditure, for instance, is inconsistent with standard monopoly theory. A better picture is one of big tech firms as, I call them Moligopolists. I'm French, we do these mashups often. Firms that coexist that's important, coexist at the same time as monopolists and oligopolists, right? The cover of the book, the yellow is from my daughter, Rachel, describes the relevance allegory. So these are spinning tops on a chessboard. The spinning top represents your archetypal big tech firm. The chess pieces describe firm active in non-digital industries or in mature technology areas. The chess pieces compete by effect trading, punctuated moves dictated by routines and rules, ordinary capabilities, if you like. By contrast, the spinning tops spiral in a relentless, emergent and unpredictable trajectory, crushing what comes through their way. So when this is the case, when this happens, this collision happens, the spinning top that moves faster display the highest survival chances across time. And the power of the spinning top is given by the modularity of technology. All right, so this is the intuition. How to verify or try to falsify the intuition? I'm not an economist. I like to say that I'm a DIY economist. I listen to a lot of podcasts and I watched a lot of courses online. I think I have a genuine good sense of economics at the intuitive level. I also like legal documents a lot. So I decided to analyze the 10K filings of the 6 largest US tech firms at the time. So these were, Google, Amazon, Netflix, Microsoft, Facebook, and I'm missing one, another one. And I went through these reports with a computer scientist and ran some sort of semantic analysis, natural language processing kind of stuff. And the empirical analysis confirmed what we said. The reports were rife with references to intense competition across markets, very high survival risks, and these observations were not found in non-digital sectors of the economy. So I ran the same analysis for telecom firms, for cement firms, for transportation firms, and so on and so forth. And there were orders of magnitudes of difference between the references that you found. I also managed to use the Stanford Business School library to retrieve a lot of market intelligence research. Things like, your classical S&P, Capital IQ, and so on and so forth. And I read all the analyst reports about these tech firms. We are talking about thousands of pages. And no analysts that run this kind of competitive analysis, competitive intelligence, was talking about monopoly power. Anyway, I thought that was enough to ground the intuition in some sense of reality. The policy implication in the book, I'm going to be very short on that, is the following, all right? And I'm going to try to say that very clearly. So the policy implication is that if we accept that these firms are monopolists and competitive oligopolists, a good thing for antitrust to do would be to try to limit monopoly rent extraction by big tech firms in markets that have tipped progressively and promote indirect entry by big tech firms in untipped markets, adjacent markets, under conditions of neutrality between the big tech firm and other entrants. Right. What this means is that antitrust should use its tools to put pressure on monopoly consolidation, monopoly maintenance strategies in the core origins markets, but do not stifle the possibility for these firms to leverage their position in other markets. They need to get a chance, as their profits go down in the tip markets, to exit and pivot into other markets. Why would we prevent this from happening? I also pushed in favor of a horizontal presumption against horizontal mergers by big tech firms in their origins markets, but against such a presumption for vertical or non-horizontal mergers. What happens then, that's the third point, the fourth point in the policymaking arena is well known. The European Union decided to adopt the DMA, an instrument that has no coherent economic theory behind it, and that restricts both rents in tipped and untipped markets indiscriminately. The DMA doesn't know what it wants to achieve. There's no KPI of success for the DMA. No one knows what this is about. The concept of contestability that's found in the DMA is not tied to any economic definition in the state of the art. The concept of fairness, I let the economists decide whether this is something that can be practiced in competition policy. If I regret something about the book, is that I didn't write fully the 6th chapter on the political harms from big tech power. this is something that I may do when I retire from the EUI after we've run fully the program of the DCI. That's it.
Okay, thanks, Nicolas. No, that's a very good introduction. Very good to set the scene. And as you mentioned this morning, we really want to look at the real horse. So I think the transition now to Rikke to give a perspective, an empirical and industry perspective, is very, very welcome. So Rikke, I would really like to hear from you your views on how regulation of the digital sector is working, and in particular the impact on innovation. And there is of course an objective of contestability in the DMA, but also, and you often hear the Commission mentioning that there is at least mention an objective that the DMA would foster innovation. And I'd really like to also have your views on that, if you have something you can mention on that, because I think there's a lot of questions that can arise in this respect. And also, I understand you have a hard stop at 2:45, so make sure you mention everything else you'd like to mention in your intervention. Also, I think one of the things that has developed a lot since Nicolas wrote his book is AI, right? So if you have any insight on that, that would be very welcome.
Absolutely. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, first of all, sorry for not being there in person today. I would have loved to, but unfortunately on holidays this week, so that's the disruption on my end. But very happy to kind of be here, at least virtually, and speak a little bit today. I think this is a topic that I think is extremely important, and we could probably speak about for hours. But nevertheless, as you said in the intro, I just want to make a few remarks on that. Work at Google. So even though that is clearly stated, the views here are obviously my own. And as you also mentioned, like I work or lead our subgroup that focus on regulation and economic strategy on like ex-ante matters. So I think I've probably lived the the true experience of the DMA, also what we have in the UK, Japan, and elsewhere, and remedy designs in other jurisdictions. So quite some comparators to lean on there, and we can discuss more in more detail. I think just a few introductory remarks from me, and then we should totally turn to discussions and questions. What Nicolas said in the beginning, there were quite a few of his remarks that almost felt like he was taking my talking points. But basically, I very much agree with a lot of the views he shared. I think just take DMA as a specific example, and I can maybe contrast that a little bit with what we've seen in the UK as an example. Like probably everyone here knows, like DMA is a list of form-based per se rules, and from my perspective, what is striking as an economist is that core economic concepts like competitive effects, efficiencies, consumer harm, and so forth are not explicit considerations in the compliance assessments. And in my view, that is a significant departure also from traditional effects-based antitrust, and even further removed from the framework and setup that Nicolas has set out in his book. What I want to say as well is like, well, you might say that at least the DMA offers predictability, but while the scope is well defined, it is a set of rules that were defined for a market of the past, in my view, 5 years or 6 years ago or so. And we today are still facing like huge challenges of unpredictability around what the Commission might deem compliant, which hasn't fully resolved the uncertainty for us that have to kind of then implement changes in the European market. And in terms of the broader justification for ex-ante regulation, as Nicolas also touched briefly on, it's justified on the basis that existing competition law might be too slow and stagnant or tipping. but I think these premises are really worth examining closely against the data we're seeing in the market today. And on the AI side of things, I think we are seeing like really a market that is the most dynamic space ever seen, probably in the digital space. And if I talk to execs in Mountain View on our end, and I ask them about like static views or anything with regard to competition, and that things are moving too slow or should be regulated, they will be laughing at me in terms of the realities we are facing on the ground, which was also touched upon in the beginning about the sheer volume of like R&D and dynamic competition we're seeing in that space. I can touch more on that later. But basically, I think in terms of whether assessing, for example, like if ex ante is really like the right thing, so to say, or the right view in the digital space, it might be, but I do think it's really important that like the consumer welfare should be forefront, and also we really need to better assess the economic trade-off. So the balancing the demand for contestability, as you mentioned, but we also need to ensure innovation incentives are not dampened and user privacy is not harmed. And from our perspective, like the burden of compliance, the unpredictability that is faced is a huge cost to innovation, at least to incumbents. And I think we are yet to kind of see the so-called benefits from a broader contestability of this regulation. And I do think those are trade-offs that need to be more core as we move forward. So I'm not sitting here saying per se that ex ante regulation is always bad or is not per se necessary, but I do believe that it has to involve a process with more both economic thinking or frameworks and legal certainty. And then I just wanted to add a note in terms of like the reality we are seeing. Even though the goal of the DMA is to ensure fairness and contestability, we are really seeing a fascinating real-time experiment in terms of what this does to the European market. From a Google perspective, we've had to delay product launches, and yeah, it's not really in my experience anything that has fostered innovation yet. I think I'll just pause there, Raphaël, if I don't know if there are any follow-up questions, or we can maybe turn to the AI topic in a bit.
No, I think that's great. That makes a lot of sense, and I think you know, we also heard from Emanuele this morning that he thinks the economists at the CT should be more involved in the application of the DMA. So at least it seems the economists are aligned on this. Just needs to convince others on the usefulness of this point. All right, so now I think I will turn to Thibault. So Thibault, of course, you have worked extensively on AI. So I think natural question to you is whether you see the Moligopoly hypothesis at work in the AI space, and if so, you know, what the policy implications would be.
All right. Let me begin with a prediction, because I gather that this sort of conferences will beg for a prediction. Now, don't worry, it isn't mine, because I've made the mistake of offering my own predictions in the past, and not today. I've learned from the experience. This prediction is one from Nicolas Petit, whose name appears on the podium right now in case you have a doubt. It dates back from 2020, and surprisingly, you actually used the very same words in introducing your book just a couple of minutes ago. Back in 2020, a much simpler time when the worst thing that could happen to you was a team call on a Tuesday, Nicolas wrote that, and I quote here, the picture of big tech firms as monopolists is intuitively attractive, but analytically wrong. Again, the very same words that you use today. I think this is precisely the kind of statements that would make some people at the European Commission really uncomfortable, and I want to discuss that. Now, what you argued, and again, this is what you presented, is that those companies may be monopolists when it comes to the core markets. However, they are subject to fierce competition in direction that no one had the courtesy to actually anticipate. And the question I want to answer in a couple of minutes is whether that hypothesis still is valid and confirmed by what we see in AI today. All right. So the short answer to that is, and I'm sorry to kill the fun already, but is positive. It would have been fun for me to come on the podium and actually try to, as Nicolas just asked me to do, destroy the book, but this is not what I will do. So here's the current received wisdom for those who have somehow missed it. What we hear when it comes to AI today is that we have a cohort of companies that includes OpenAI, Google, Anthropic, Microsoft, and others who have achieved a good position when it comes to some specific layers of the AI stack. Now, the policy response with a unanimity that would warm the hearts of someone in a Brussels committee has been to reach for immediate monopoly diagnosis, right? And we hear that when it comes to, let's say, chips manufacturing, we've heard that this morning, or even when it comes to the deployment of foundation model. So the policy consequences of this diagnosis is to break companies, to force data sharing, to impose access obligation, and to treat AI as an infrastructure the way we treat electricity grids. We hear this analogy quite regularly. Now, I understand the impulse. The concentration, as I will cover today, is real. The stakes are significant. And monopoly happens to be a concept that we all have a slide about that is ready to be deployed. Now, Nicolas told us something in 2020, which I think, and I'm afraid, remains useful today, which is that the reflex is actually wrong. And it is actually not just wrong. The more you look at AI, the more wrong the reflex of just putting out the monopoly box actually is. And the reason for that is one of increasing returns. This was my attempt at asking AI to summarize Nicolas' book. So if you are interested in that, this was quite fun. And I have to confess that I was so confused that I eventually let it go. All right, so let me talk about increasing returns. And I believe we're going to hear a keynote about this concept later on today. In fact, we will do some very heavy lifting when it comes to the remainder of my talk here today. So what do we see when it comes to AI? And I will look here at the foundation model layer. So the more a foundation model is actually used, the more data it accumulates about the way people use it. Importantly, the more developers want to develop compatible applications that will run on top of the foundation model, which will attract new users and so on and so forth. The more the company is generating revenues, which means that the company can actually sign a good exclusive partnership in terms of getting new data, which will then generate new use cases and will attract more people. And the more the reputation of the foundation model grows. Think of it as being Apple. If you want to deploy AI to an iPhone, you may have a very strong incentive to deploy OpenAI or Google or Apple because this is known already, as opposed to going for one of those open source model on Hugging Face. So all of that is the story of increasing returns when you see that the dynamic feeds to the other elements in the story. Think of it as the snowball effect. Now, the result of that is that you do not merely end up with a larger company, you end up with a system which is actually displaying a mechanism where being ahead would lead to actually growing even faster than the other companies. So in a world, here what we have is the opposite of a self-correcting equilibrium that the economic models tend to prefer. Now, Brian Arthur, here in the room, explained these dynamics in 1990s. The concept of increasing return, I would submit, is the single most important concept for understanding AI competition today. Nicolas' Moligopoly thesis rests on precisely this mechanism. And what's quite interesting is that if you look closely at the companies in the space, they are all running really fast. And yes, this is AI generated. Usain Bolt, as far as I know, doesn't have a partnership with OpenAI. But this is definitely not the face of a company who's running quietly and peacefully and do not feel any competitive pressure. And I want to cover why this is. Okay, so let me provide some evidence. So when OpenAI launched GPT-4, you will remember that this was about 2 years ago. Many observers concluded that the race was, in practical terms, pretty much finished. That OpenAI would be the new Google. You have many articles, if you use the Wayback Machine, that you can retrieve on a subject. And in fact, we see that today, many people call OpenAI today one of the big tech companies, right? Now, let me tell you something that I know from running is that, again, monopolists do not look this way. And I won't provide you with a picture of a monopolist running because this may be too disgusting. In fact, they don't run, they definitely walk. Now, 2 years later, we have Llama 4 put out by Meta, which is outperforming many of the large foundation models out there, even the tiny version of Llama 4. We have Mistral, a company that has been founded by DeepMind researchers who apparently departed with some energy, employing at the time less than 10 employees and even not so long ago, less than 50 employees, which is running quite competitively in the space. The open source dimension of AI is not a footnote for those with a strong ideology into open source. In fact, you may have seen just last week that Google put out a new model, Gamma 4, and this illustrates precisely the competitive pressure that open source is putting on proprietary model, including the ones by Anthropic and OpenAI. You can see, as Google advertised here, this is a screenshot I took just 2 days ago, that in fact, you could run locally this foundation model just using the computer power of your smartphone. And the examples accumulate. Claude, or should I say Anthropic, released the MCP technology. That's basically an open source technology that enables you to plug your foundation model to existing software and services. And the downstream effects are substantial. We see that Opus 4.6, which is the big model put out by Claude, is now being described in certain quarters as the first genuine AI agent model at scale, or some people even call it AGI. Closer to today, this was put out about 2 weeks ago. Yann Lequin, or should I say, to please Beau, Yann Lecun, is French, but it's fine, put out a model, Le World model, that approximately 3 weeks ago broke the news being trainable on a single GPU in just a couple hours. And this model, you see that in the benchmark, outperforms today some of the large foundation models that we've all been using. And a fortnight ago, some Caltech researchers, this is published in the Wall Street Journal just last week, actually published a 1-bit large language model, which by achieving substantial compression without performance loss, for the very first time, and I want to insist on that because this is important, for the very first time, makes efficiency in how you train the model something that generally rivals the scale of the model. So this is not just that we are going into the space where efficiency could become a competitive parameter, but it is here defining competition in the space. Now, all of this in Nicolas' framework is the indirect entry that makes the Moligopoly function a Moligopoly rather than a monopoly. And please note something which has become quite obvious in the last couple of minutes, which is that the foundation model layer is already concentrated. I've been talking about Google, OpenAI, Meta, and a couple other companies. And that foundation model layer is concentrated precisely because of increasing returns. And you know what? It's fine. It's fine because it is competitive. It is a textbook Moligopoly. Now, back to monopolies. They are quiet, right? You've all heard about John Hicks, The Quiet Life of the Monopolists. And in fact, if we were to see monopolists in the space, what we would see are a couple companies able to extract rents from a stable, entrenched position, and they would charge accordingly. Now, this is the answer as to why monopolists actually stay quiet, but this is definitely not something that we see in the space. In fact, if you look at the B2C market, you see that Anthropic is now leading by far and is far ahead of OpenAI, which is creating a real concern in the space. And to give you some number, Anthropic announced just this week that they have a new foundation model that they're not going to release because it is too dangerous, called Mythos. They allegedly spent over $10 billion to train this foundation model. To me, this doesn't look like the behavior of a monopolist who's quite certain that the market shares will stay stable. Now, the real question is, and I want to push further on that, we have a Moligopoly scenario when it comes to AI, but the real reason is why do we have it and why do we see concentration in the space? And in fact, here drawing on some of the work I published with Sandy Pentland and Jason Potts, one of the DCI lovers, is that those increasing returns, for the most part, are quality driven. And I would submit, contrary to what we've heard this morning on some panels, that quality driven market dominance is actually fine in antitrust. This is not something that we may be or want to be concerned about. So the remaining question is, what if we, in a couple months or a couple years from now, see that the Moligopoly hypothesis in AI is actually on the decline, meaning that there is less of a possibility for indirect competition in the space? Or to come back to the analogy of the book, what if the spinning top stops spinning? What do we do? Now, let me share a couple concerns about the cure that some of our policymakers have imagined to actually counter some of those concerns. And the first one I want to mention is the AI Act, because the AI Act does not appear as being relevant to competition lawyers and economists, but in fact it is, for multiple reasons. Now, the AI Act, according to some of these provisions, including Article 11, mandates that every company deploying a foundation model that may create some systemic concern or high-risk concern will have to produce technical documentation, something similar to what the DOJ imposed Microsoft would do back in the days. It took Microsoft, just to put some perspective on that, over 1,000 employees, over 10 years generating the technical documentation. The AI Act imposing something similar to startups in the EU, again, as long as their AI system is high risk or presents some of the capabilities that we deemed to be risky. So I would see how this kind of regulation is indeed something that could actually extinguish the Moligopoly hypothesis by creating a proper monopoly where some companies will be able to afford to comply and some others will not. Now, originally, I planned to spend a couple minutes on the DMA, but I am now conducting an experiment with myself. I am attempting not to spend an entire section of the conference hammering the DMA. In fact, because I believe the DMA is not even legally valid. Now, I can report that I do not very much enjoy the experience of not talking about the DMA and will probably end the experiment by the end of the month. But not today. I'm not going to talk about the DMA, but just keep in mind that, again, if you try to apply such a taxonomy, which has been conceived for stable intermediation services, to a world in which we have a spinning top that is ever accelerating, this will create issues down the line. And I will now finish with what we should do with all this. And again, here trying to see if there are insights from the book. The first one is something that David Thies and others here have been pushing for a long time, which is an innovation-first policy. I think what it asks is to really consider whether we want a precautionary principle in competition in AI, or whether by forcing such a principle with the DMA, with the AI Act, the Data Act, Data Governance Act, Networks Act, and others, we are actually helping competition more than hurting competition. The second policy is one to protect open source innovation in the space. Now, again, this is not just a hobby. This is something that is generally creating competitive pressure in the space. Think of Llama, think of Google Gemma and others, and think of Mistral, which has been powering open source competition for quite some time. Now, the problem I have with the way we regulate open source today, including in the AI Act and other regulation, is that we qualify a foundation model for being open source or not. This is a black and white story, but if you look at it closely, open source is on a spectrum and the regulation fails to capture this spectrum, which would mean that we'll misallocate some exemptions to companies that are not actually providing something which is open source, but might be just open weight. And the third is to actually go after adaptive regulation. AI regulation will never be future-proof. This is a fantasy, and this is actually an expensive fantasy. I think instead what we want is future-responsive regulation that can adapt to its capacity to attain some objective. But as Nicolas just said, when it comes to the DMA and measuring the fairness of markets, who is now in a position. Sorry? Yeah, I spoke about the DMA. So let me talk about the AI Act. Who's in a position to say whether our human rights are better protected today than they were a week ago? Or to talk about the DMA just a tiny bit, who's in a position to say that today the market is fairer than it was a week ago or a month ago? Well, good luck with that. So if we want to go for some adaptive regulation, I think we first need to define what's the objective of the regulation, how do we measure whether or not the objective is attained, and in case it is not, what do we do? Maybe we make the regulation actually more stringent on the companies. So let me close with, again, coming back to Nicolas' cover, which I think has done an admirable service throughout the talk and throughout the last couple of months. So what we have is a spinning top on a chessboard. Now, the real interesting question, and I think this might be the first time you see the book actually moving. So see, this is dynamism in action. Well, we'll talk about the royalties. Is whether the spinning top is here AI or AI enhanced companies with AI capabilities disrupting all of the other companies that are digital player this time around. The answer as I speak is yes. But my fear is that we are still counting how many pieces do we have on the chessboard, which does very little when it comes to understanding the competition dynamics behind. So the Moligopoly scenario holds. In fact, I think that now we have a diagnosis. So if you were to publish version 2 of the book, I would rebrand the book the Moligopoly diagnosis instead of hypothesis. But I hear that you don't want to do that. And it means that we need to actually push for new policies, counting how many players we have in manufacturing chips will do very little when it comes to understanding competition in AI. I hope that I convey the points, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks. And on that, I mean, Emanuele this morning mentioned the bottleneck in the supply chain. So I suppose he had in mind the GPU, right?
Yeah, so again, think about low world model, one single GPU. Think about DeepSeek, 10 million euros or $10 million to develop the foundation model, as opposed to the one that was competing at the times, which was GPT-4, which is more than $1 billion. So it shows that at the foundation model layer, the technique that you're going to deploy, you can also think about tiny recursive models and other technologies will actually be a way to circumvent any concentration at the chips layer. So this is why this is a complicated story, and just saying we have monopoly by counting how many players, I think, as Nicolas warned, is not doing the trick.
Hi, sorry, I forgot to put my mic. So I was asking Rikke if you would want to comment following Thibault's presentation.
Yeah, no, I think that was a great presentation and very much reflects what happens on the ground. Sorry, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, the sound is breaking up a little bit from the room. Okay, cool. So basically, I just want to say, like, adding to the spiel that was just laid out here, which was great. I also think it's important, like, often we hear in discussions with regulators and in other panels and conferences about like the urge to regulate AI and this like fear of losing out and what happened with Web 2.0. And I just think it's really important also to take a step back, and this goes a little bit back to what I said before around the economics and the analysis and data and evidence being front and center of anything we do in the space. Because what market do we even refer to when we consider potential concentration in AI, or if there's any market tipping happening? I think it would be a mistake to view AI as a standalone product or a platform. To me, it's like an enabling technology across many products, many markets, and these are applications that are still unfolding and that create business opportunities and that has a huge market upside and potential, which is also seen in terms of the capex and R&D raise that we're seeing amongst us from a Google perspective and other firms today. And I do think we don't even know what is the winning business model yet, even from a Google perspective. Or where the long-term commercial anchors are yet to be settled. So we are still in this experimental generational technology shift, and I do think I would just urge some cautious approach to intervening in this space in any way. And I think then back to the Moligopoly scenario, like the framework, what we have seen over the last few years, I think is literally empirical evidence that this is playing out in practice. And we have seen, just take like a market like search, like the modality shift where we have competition isn't just search versus search, like it's search versus like information seeking in different ways. So like indirect entry as also touched upon in the book, and with new players offering completely different value propositions that compete for the same user time. So I think those are some high level remarks I wanted to make on that. Then I think from a intervention, should anything be done? I do think it's important, again, going back to like make sure the markets are basically assessed. What are we seeing in terms of effects that might be happening today? Is there a tipping path or not? There are some core differences from Web 2.0. The economic forces that at least allegedly drove concentration in the past, specifically like strong network effects, data feedback loops, zero pricing, are largely absent, I'd say, or much weaker in the Gen AI space. So these are worth considering, and literally what is happening in the market today. And then I also think it's really important to think about from a policy intervention perspective that, and this was touched upon just before, but if anything has to be done, I would say promote entry through openness, ensure that it's like literally the focus, and in addition, I would say interoperability and choice over mandates. My fear would be if anything, or like any interventions would come into the market and actually be regulating again a view of the past versus what the future might look like. So anything like interoperability wise and so forth should be led by industry standards rather than a rigid set of or mandates or rigid rules. Those are a few reactions to what was just laid out.
Great, thanks very much. So I think before we open the floor for questions and comments, should get back to Nicolas and see what his thoughts are on this discussion, whether you agree with what has been said or not.
Yeah, so I completely agree with Thibault. I find the discussion today about trying to update the DMA CPS or trying to develop some intelligence on gatekeeping in cloud or agentic AI or foundation models, I think this is just a waste of resources from competition agencies. I mean, there is no sign that competition is not running at full pace in these sectors. There is a lot of horizontal differentiation, open source models, closed source models. There is vertical integration in some companies like Google that is vertically integrated in TPUs. They have now their own GPUs. Amazon has a Trainium. There is lots of different verticals, firms that target the B2B markets like Mistral and others that target the B2C market. OpenAI is an old company. It's a 10-year-old company. People forget that. OpenAI is 10-year-old. There's Entry, DeepSeek, and others. So I think this is completely misplaced. In fact, if competition agencies wanted to do their work in that space, they would probably do something very different. So I'm going to give you a very concrete example. If you speak with European firms that try to develop models, when you ask them, what is the main threat to competition you see coming for you? They say copyright litigation, right? The one thing that could wipe out the only AI firm in Europe is the risk of copyright litigation, opt out from TDM by copyright holders. This would wipe out, one suit could wipe out the entire capital base of Mistral AI, right? Anthropic got very lucky. They got an infusion of cash before they had to pay this settlement with rights holders in the United States. So if you want to kill competition in AI, you are going to go very hard on copyright. And that is going to limit the universe of players in that space. I'm not saying copyright holders do not deserve indemnification, but I'm just saying we may want to be a bit considerate with what we do there. That's one thing we would do. Instead of wasting resources and trying to think about whether the DMA should be updated for markets which are extremely competitive.
Great. Yeah. Perfect. And I think we can turn to the audience. I see Ben, you have one.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment on Thibault's hypothesis that the foundational model market is already concentrated and oligopolized. I don't think that's true. Like from a business user perspective, I think we're way too focused on the large firms, but there are hundreds of models out there, open source or proprietary. Lots of them also developed outside the US. And without giving too much away, I mean, some of the products we're developing right now, they're not using any of the large language models developed by the very largest firms, because the performance is very domain specific. So these performance metrics you always see on the internet, they're very generic. Like they bear no correlation to the performance metrics that we are actually looking for. So the ones that we're looking at right now are like much smaller firms who perform very well in a particular area. And it's also not the case that you're just using one model. Right? You're using one model for one task and you're combining it with other models. So for some of the products we're looking at, we're using dozens of different models, and we're using the ones that's like very domain specific and has the highest performance. So I think and I also think it's still very early in the day. I mean, I've really pushed back on the notion that we're already in a Moligopoly scenario here. I think the market is wide open, and I don't see any concerns at this point in time.
Right. Yes, Christopher.
So I love this thesis, Nicolas, so thank you. It very much reminds me, though, of a discourse we had about 20 years ago. And there's a piece in a book by Tim Bresnahan, it's overlooked often, where he said, it was before he became the expert for the government of the Microsoft case. And he said, even if it weren't Microsoft, we'd still have a monopoly operating system. But what he saw was the layers each being dominated by a single monopolist, but them pressuring against each other. And he said, in this sort of Coninck idea, the government have two roles: accelerate the next revolution or promote normal science. He says normal science is doing fine. Government can't predict the next big revolution anyway, until it's already done, in which there's no point. Can we learn anything? I mean, is this bear similarities to what we've seen in the Microsoft cases, or where they were talking about the cable modem access, the sort of open access to internet systems, And if so, are there lessons for us now? Or is the analogy just off?
One, two.
So it's interesting you mentioned Tim Bresnahan. I was in touch with him when we were at Stanford and with Bo, and we spoke about him about this intuition, and he was very supportive. He also wrote papers with Shane Greenstein, who commented on the book. The way they model this competition is through this process of what they call indirect entry that Thibault mentioned. So firms are not going to try to enter the core platform market. This is a sort of fallacy. The DMA is built on this fallacy that you're going to have Google, Moogle, Zoogle, and Doogle one day in the market. This is not going to happen. The process will take place through a form of indirect entry into an adjacent, related, lateral market that is going to displace the value. And the relevant question, and we speak about that with Bo all the time, is not how big the market share of the company in the initial market. The relevant question is how long is that market share still high? So if we could know whether it's good that Apple is taking a 30% cut on app developers, I know it's changed, for about 25 years, and if we could agree that maybe 25 is a bit too much, we would make a lot of progress, right? I think that is a relevant question, but it is not the question that competition agencies tackle. And I think the Bresnahan and Greenstein and Trajanberg kind of framework invites us to think like this, right? So you want to observe indirect entry, and is this fast enough, right? And we need to put we need to put a value on time. What's your discount factor, right? That is the question.
Okay, 2 points. So I think we actually do agree. So I was not suggesting that you don't have a lot of foundations model out there. In fact, Stanford HAI every year publishes a report. The new one is coming up next week. And they list that there are every year about 200 large foundation model, general purpose foundation model that becomes available. And if you go on Hugging Face, I think, don't take me on the exact numbers, but they claim that they have 2.4 million foundation models. So you have a lot of them out there. I was just coming from the perspective that, and this is something I do in conferences, if I were to ask people around which of the foundation models are you using, I'm guessing OpenAI, Claude, Google, would be dominating the market. But the other ones, they actually do put pressure on those companies, which is why that even when it comes to end users, we may see a concentration in terms of market shares. This is, as Nicolas warned, the stupid way of looking at it, which is just counting how many horse or how many chess player, right? As to your point, Christopher, so I would very much agree that there is a lot we can learn from it. I would see two differences between the Microsoft times and what we see in AI today. The first one, and this is something which is not just science fiction anymore, I have a paper coming on that, we see autonomous evolution of AI, which is new, right? Because the technology is being recombined by humans, but also by the technology itself. So if anything that is ever accelerating the speed by which AI is evolving and moving, through one paradigm to the other. The second one, and this one is fundamental to us lawyers when we try to regulate it, is that when it comes to AI, very often from the foundation model, you see functional indivisibility, which means that you may train the foundation model to achieve one specific task, but other functions will emerge out of it. And in fact, try to use it. Deploy an agent on your computer, and you're going to be able to see that you can use it to generate recipes, to run software on your computer, to edit emails, to move software from one place to the other. So if those functions actually emerge out of a single foundation model, we can't just look at a foundation model for one specific use case, which is what we've done in the regulation that starts with a D as an M and then an A at the very end, the one that I won't talk about today. So this is a big difference, and I think something for the policymakers to consider.
All right, we have just a few minutes left, so we should take the last questions. Yes, Maxime.
Yeah, just without wanting to make Thibault fluster anymore and using the DMA term again, just to say I fully agree with your comments, leaving the legality aside. My main issue and concern is that this instrument is just based on an extremely static, the most static view of the market possible, right? It is completely unfit for purpose to assess anything that has to do with dynamic markets such as AI, with dynamic industries and technologies. So in my mind, and with all due respect to the Commission for trying to package it within the DMA scope, I think, and I'm sure they mean well in many ways, but I think it's borderline hubris because, you know, even companies cannot control the evolution of this beast that we have in front of us. That's one thing. And the second thing is, as regards the assessment of the effectiveness, essentially, of the regulation, and the discussion before that David Thies had about how it's important to focus on rather than consumer harm, focus on the ecosystem. I think in this instance, there's been way too much focus on the ecosystem, and rightly so, there has been a lot of criticism about the unobserved consumer benefits that this regulation had, or other related regulations that have to do with boxing innovative technologies. There's been criticism because I think a lot of us are suffering with our experience of our devices ever since limitations were in place on the so-called gatekeepers. So there may be, because ultimately all these technologies are meant to make our lives better, easier. There may be a need to factor consumer benefits into the discussion a bit more, rather than primarily pure economics of the market and the ecosystem.
All right, and very, very quickly, just if you can, very quickly.
Yeah, usually I find myself criticizing the agencies and, you know, different acts and so on. But here in this forum, I find myself kind of in a different position, because where is the debate? Are we all so sure about everything that we're saying? Like, look, I'm someone who thinks actually that Google and Apple compete in mobile, right? To some extent, definitely, and maybe enough. But, you know, aren't we so relaxed? And I think myself included in criticizing DSA, DMA, etc., just because of the advances that we've made in antitrust policy over the past 20 years. Like, if we didn't have Microsoft cases, if we didn't have IBM interventions back in the day, would we actually not be concerned today? What if Google or Apple, for example, could control which models, which AI models and platforms are available on their, you know, on their operating systems?
Okay, maybe you want to respond to that.
So I think we have extremely flimsy evidence of the long-term impact on innovation of cases like EU Microsoft or US Microsoft or US IBM. The evidence is very, very scattered, and so it's a very hard claim to say, well, this case is basically unleashed innovation in the economy. There are papers that say yes, papers that say no. I don't think we can rely on that. What I worry about is things that defy common sense. So if you read in an antitrust decision that, just like you say, Google and Apple do not compete in mobile, this means that a horizontal merger between Google and Apple would not be treated as a categorically anti-competitive merger, right? And the same when the FTC says that Meta and Instagram do not compete, right? Or Meta and TikTok do not compete. It means that Meta could perfectly acquire TikTok tomorrow. This would not be treated as a horizontal merger. So these things defy common sense, and everyone feels it. The problem is how, as Maxi was saying, how do you bring common sense into the DMA? What is the process that allows us to say, hey, there is consumer friction here. There's not consumer benefit. So if you think about a legal process to do that, we're going to work on this, right?
Yeah, and we should probably think about the economic process for that too.